Part 2. Lessons from the Past. Chapter 4. Revolutionary Terror from Robespierre to Mao. What do you want? In his Logique des Mondes, Alain Badiou elaborates the eternal idea of the politics of revolutionary justice at work from the ancient Chinese legists through the Jacobins to Lenin and Mao. It consists of 4 moments: voluntarism, the belief that one can move mountains, ignoring objective laws and obstacles; terror, a ruthless will to crush the enemy of the people; egalitarian justice, its immediate brutal imposition, with no understanding for the complex circumstances which allegedly compel us to proceed gradually; and, last but not least, trust in the people. Suffice it to recall 2 examples here. Robespierre himself, his A Great Truth. The characteristic of popular government is to be trustful towards the people and severe towards the self. And Mao's critique of Stalin's economic problems of socialism in the USSR, where he qualifies Stalin's point of view as almost altogether wrong. The basic error is mistrust of the peasants. In modern European history, the first to fully enact the politics of revolutionary justice were the Jacobins in the course of the French Revolution. When, in 1953, Zhou Enlai, the Chinese Prime Minister, was in Geneva for the peace negotiations to end the Korean War, a French journalist asked him what he thought about the French Revolution. Zhou replied, "It is still too early to tell." In a way, he was right. With the disintegration of the people's democracies in the late 1990s, the struggle for the historical significance of the French Revolution flared up again. The liberal revisionists tried to impose the notion that the demise of communism in 1989 occurred at exactly the right moment. It marked the end of the era which began in 1789, the final failure of the statist revolutionary model, which first entered the scene with the Jacobins. Nowhere is the dictum, "Every history is a history of the present," more true than in the case of the French Revolution. Its historiographical reception has always closely mirrored the twists and turns of political struggles. The identifying mark of all kinds of conservatives is its flat rejection. The French Revolution was a catastrophe from the very beginning, the product of the godless modern mind. It is to be interpreted as God's punishment for humanity's wicked ways, so its traces should be effaced as thoroughly as possible. The typical liberal attitude is a differentiated one. Its formula is 1789 without 1793. In short, what the sensitive liberals want is a decaffeinated revolution, or a revolution which does not smell of a revolution. François Furet and others thus tried to deprive the French Revolution of its status as the founding event of modern democracy, relegating it to a historical anomaly. There was a historical necessity to assert the modern principles of personal freedom and so forth, but, as the English example demonstrates, the same could have been much more effectively achieved in a more peaceful way. Radicals are, on the contrary, possessed by what Alain Badiou calls the passion of the real. If you say A, equality, human rights, and freedom, you should not shirk from its consequences and gather the courage to say B, the terror needed to really defend and assert the A. And the same goes for the memory of May 1968. Days before the second round of the presidential elections in May 2007, Nicolas Sarkozy formulated the exorcism of the ghost of May 68 as the true choice facing the electorate. In this election, we should learn whether the inheritance of May 68 is to be perpetuated, or whether it should be liquidated once and for all. I want to turn the page of May 68. While one should defend the memory of 68, one should also bear in mind that the content of this memory is the stake of an ideological struggle, as Daniel Ben Said and Alain Krivine pointed out recently. There is their May and ours. The predominant liberal discourse appropriated the May 68 events as the beginning of the end of the traditional left, as the explosion of youthful energy and creativity, as France's belated entrance into hedonist modernity. For the left, on the contrary, May 68 was the unique moment of a general strike which paralyzed France and evoked the spectre of the disintegration of state power, the moment of unification, of the students' contestation with the workers' protests, part of the larger movement which encompassed student movements in the US, Germany, and Italy. However, it is all too easy to say that today's left should simply continue along this path. Some kind of historical rupture, effectively took place in 1990. Everyone, the contemporary radical left included, is somehow ashamed of the Jacobin legacy of revolutionary terror with its state-centralized character, so that the current doxa is that the left, if it is to regain political efficacy, should thoroughly reinvent itself, finally abandoning the so-called Jacobin paradigm. In our postmodern era of emergent properties, chaotic interaction of multiple subjectivities, of free interaction instead of centralized hierarchy, of a multitude of opinions instead of one truth, the Jacobin dictatorship is fundamentally not to our taste. The term taste should be given all its historical weight, as a word capturing a basic ideological disposition. Can one imagine anything more foreign to our universe of the freedom of opinions, of market competition, of nomadic pluralist interaction, and so on and so forth, than Robespierre's politics of truth, with a capital T, of course, whose proclaimed goal is to return the destiny of liberty into the hands of the truth. Such a truth can only be enforced in a terrorist manner. If the mainspring of popular government in peacetime is virtue, amid revolution it is at the same time virtue and terror. Virtue, without which terror is fatal. Terror, without which virtue is impotent. Terror is nothing but prompt, severe, inflexible justice. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. It is less a special principle than a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to our country's most pressing needs. This line of argumentation reaches its climax, paradoxical identification of its opposites. Revolutionary terror sublates the opposition between punishment and clemency. Just and severe punishment of the enemies is the highest form of clemency, so that rigor and charity coincide in terror. To punish the oppressors of humanity is clemency. To pardon them is barbarity. The rigor of tyrants has only rigor for a principle. The rigor of the Republican government comes from charity. Robespierre, Virtue and Terror. Do we still have ears for such a revolutionary coincidence of the opposites, of punishment and charity, of terror and freedom? The popular image of Robespierre is that of a kind of inverted elephant man. While the latter had a terribly deformed body, hiding a gentle and intelligent soul, Robespierre was a kind and polite person, hiding ice-cold, cruel determination, as signaled by his green eyes. As such, Robespierre serves perfectly today's anti-totalitarian liberals who no longer need to portray him as a cruel monster with a sneering evil smile, as was the case for 19th century reactionaries. Everyone is ready to recognize his moral integrity and full devotion to the revolutionary cause, since his very purity is the problem, the source of all trouble. As is indicated by the title of the latest biography of Robespierre, Ruth Sker's Fatal Purity. And, so that no one misses the point, Antonia Fraser, in her review, draws a chilling lesson for us today. Robespierre was personally honest and sincere, but the bloodlettings brought about by this sincere man surely warn us that belief in your own righteousness to the exclusion of all else can be as dangerous as the more cynical motivation of a deliberate tyrant. Happy are we who live under cynical public opinion manipulators, not under the sincere Muslim fundamentalists ready to fully engage themselves in their projects. What better proof of the ethico-political misery of our epoch, whose ultimate mobilizing motif is the mistrust of virtue? What then should those who remain faithful to the legacy of the radical left do with all this? Two things at the very least. First, the terrorist past has to be accepted as ours, even, or precisely because, it is critically rejected. The only alternative to the half-hearted defensive position of feeling guilty faced with our liberal or rightist critics is we have to do the critical job better than our opponents. This, however, is not the entire story. One should also not allow our opponents to determine the terms and topic of the struggle. What this means is that ruthless self-criticism should go hand in hand with the fearless admission of what, to paraphrase Marx's judgment on Hegel's dialectics, one is tempted to call the rational kernel of the Jacobin terror. Materialist dialectics assumes, without particular joy, that, till now, no political subject was able to arrive at the eternity of the truth it was deploying without moments of terror. For, as Saint-Just asked, what do those who want neither virtue nor terror want? His answer is well known. They want corruption, another name for the subject's defeat. Badiou, logique des mondes. Or, as Saint-Just put it succinctly elsewhere, that which produces the general good is always terrible. These words should not be interpreted as a warning against the temptation to violently impose the general good on a society, but, on the contrary, as a bitter truth to be fully endorsed. The further critical point to bear in mind is that, for Robespierre, revolutionary terror is the very opposite of war. Robespierre was a pacifist, not out of hypocrisy or humanitarian sensitivity, but because he was well aware that war between nations, as a rule, serves as the means to obfuscate revolutionary struggle within each nation. Robespierre's speech on war is of special importance today. It shows him as a true peace lover who ruthlessly denounces the patriotic call to war, even if the war is formulated as the defense of the revolution. For it is the attempt of those who want revolution without revolution to divert the radicalization of the revolutionary process. His stance is thus the exact opposite of those who need war to militarize social life and take dictatorial control over it. Which is why Robespierre also denounced the temptation to export revolution to other countries, forcefully liberating them. The French are not afflicted with a mania for rendering any nation happy and free against its will. All the kings could have vegetated or died unpunished on their blood-spattered thrones if they had been able to respect the French people's independence. Jacobin revolutionary terror is sometimes half justified as the founding crime of the bourgeois universe of law and order, in which citizens are allowed to pursue their interests in peace. But one should reject this claim on two accounts. Not only is it factually wrong, many conservatives were quite right to point out that one can achieve bourgeois law and order without terrorist excesses, as was the case in Great Britain, although there is Cromwell to remember. Much more important, the revolutionary terror of 1792 to 94 was not a case of what Walter Benjamin and others call state-founding violence, but a case of divine violence. Interpreters of Benjamin wonder what divine violence could effectively mean. Is it yet another leftist dream of a pure event which never really takes place? One should recall here Friedrich Engels' reference to the Paris Commune as an example of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Of late, the social democratic Philistine has once more been filled with wholesome terror at the words, dictatorship of the proletariat. Well and good, gentlemen. Do you want to know what this dictatorship looks like? Look at the Paris Commune. That was the dictatorship of the proletariat. One should repeat this, mutatis mutandis, apropos divine violence. Well and good, gentlemen, critical theorists. Do you want to know what this divine violence looks like? Look at the revolutionary terror of 1792 to 94. That was divine violence. And the series can continue, the Red Terror of 1919. That is to say, one should fearlessly identify divine violence with positively existing historical phenomena, thus avoiding all obscurantist mystification. When those outside the structured social field strike blindly, demanding and enacting immediate justice, vengeance, this is divine violence. Recall a decade or so ago the panic in Rio de Janeiro when crowds descended from the favelas into the wealthy part of the city and started looting and burning supermarkets. This was divine violence. Like biblical locusts, divine punishment for men's sinful ways, it strikes from out of nowhere, a means without an end, or as Robespierre put it in his speech in which he demanded the execution of Louis XVI. Peoples do not judge in the same way as courts of law, They do not hand down sentences. They throw thunderbolts. They do not condemn kings. They drop them back into the void. And this justice is worth just as much as that of the courts. The dictatorship of the proletariat is thus another name for Benjaminian divine violence, which is outside the law, a violence exerted as brutal revenge justice. But why divine? Divine points towards the dimension of the inhuman. One should thus posit a double equation. Divine violence equals inhuman terror equals dictatorship of the proletariat. Benjaminian divine violence should be conceived as divine in the precise sense of the old Latin motto, vox populi, vox Dei, not in the perverse sense of we are doing it as mere instruments of the people's will, but as the heroic assumption of the solitude of a sovereign decision. It is a decision, to kill, to risk or lose one's own life, made in absolute solitude, with no cover from the big other. If it is extra-moral, it is not immoral. It does not give the agent the license just to kill with some kind of angelic innocence. The motto of divine violence is fiat instantia, pereat mundus. It is through justice, the point of non-distinction between justice and vengeance, that the people, the anonymous part of no part, imposes its terror and makes other parts pay the price. Judgment Day for the long history of oppression, exploitation, suffering, or, as Robespierre himself put it in a poignant manner, what do you want, you who would like truth to be powerless on the lips of representatives of the French people? Truth undoubtedly has its power. It has its anger, its own despotism. It has touching accents and terrible ones that resound with force in pure hearts as in guilty consciences. And that untruth can no more imitate than Salome can imitate the thunderbolts of heaven, but accuse nature of it, accuse the people which wants it and loves it. And this is what Robespierre is targeting in his famous accusation to the moderates, that what they really want is a revolution without a revolution. They want a revolution deprived of the excess in which democracy and terror coincide. A revolution respecting social rules, subordinated to pre-existing norms. A revolution in which violence is deprived of the divine dimension and thus reduced to a strategic intervention serving precise and limited goals. Citizens, did you want a revolution without a revolution? What is this spirit of persecution that has come to revise, so to speak, the one that broke our chains? But what sure judgment can one make of the effects that can follow these great commotions? Who can mark, after the event, the exact point at which the waves of popular insurrection should break? At that price, what people could ever have shaken off the yoke of despotism? For while it is true that a great nation cannot rise in a simultaneous movement, and that tyranny can only be hit by the portion of citizens that is closest to it, how would these ever dare to attack it if, after the victory, delegates from remote parts could hold them responsible for the duration of violence of the political torment that had saved the homeland? They ought to be regarded as justified by tacit proxy for the whole of society. The French, Friends of Liberty, meeting in Paris last August, acted in that role, in the name of all the départements. They should either be approved or repudiated entirely. To make them criminally responsible for a few apparent or real disorders, inseparable from so great a shock, would be to punish them for their devotion. This authentic revolutionary logic can be discerned already at the level of rhetorical figures, where Robespierre likes to turn around the standard procedure of first evoking an apparently realistic position and then displaying its illusory nature. He often starts with presenting a position or description of a situation as an absurd exaggeration, a fiction, and then goes on to remind us that what, in a first approach, cannot but appear as a fiction is actually truth itself. But what am I saying? What I have just presented as an absurd hypothesis is actually a very certain reality. It is this radical revolutionary stance, which also enables Robespierre to denounce the humanitarian concern with victims of revolutionary divine violence. A sensibility that wails almost exclusively over the enemies of liberty seems suspect to me. Stop shaking the tyrant's bloody robe in my face, or I will believe that you wish to put Rome in chains. Asserting the inhuman. Critical analysis and the acceptance of the historical legacy of the Jacobins overlap in the real question to be raised. Does the, often deplorable, actuality of revolutionary terror compel us to reject the very idea of terror, or is there a way to repeat it in today's different historical constellation, to redeem its virtual content from its actualization? We claim here that it can and should be done, and the most concise formula of repeating the event designated by the name Robespierre is to pass from Robespierre's humanist terror to anti-humanist, or rather inhuman, terror. In his Le Siècle, Alain Badiou detects a sign of the political regression that occurred towards the end of the 20th century in the shift from humanism and terror to humanism or terror. In 1946, Maurice Merleau-Ponty wrote Humanism and Terror, his defense of Soviet communism as involving a kind of Pascalian wager that announces the trope which Bernard Williams later called moral luck. The present terror will be retroactively justified if the society that emerges from it is truly human. Today, such a conjunction of terror and humanism is properly unthinkable. The predominant liberal view replaces and with or, either humanism or terror. More precisely, there are 4 variations on this motif: humanism and terror, humanism or terror, each either in a positive or in a negative sense. Humanism and terror, in a positive sense, is what Merleau-Ponty elaborated. It sustains Stalinism, the forceful terrorist engendering of the new man, and is already clearly discernible in the French Revolution in the guise of Robespierre's conjunction of virtue and terror. This conjunction can be negated in 2 ways. It can involve the choice humanism or terror, that is, the liberal humanist project in all its versions, from dissident anti-Stalinist humanism up to and including today's neo-Habermasians, such as Luc Ferry and Alain Renaud in France, and other defenders of human rights against totalitarian fundamentalist terror. Or it can retain the conjunction humanism and terror, but in a negative mode. All those philosophical and ideological orientations, from Heidegger and conservative Christians to partisans of Oriental spirituality and deep ecology, who perceive terror as the truth, the ultimate consequence of the humanist project itself, of its hubris. There is, however, a 4th variation, usually left aside: the choice humanism or terror, but with terror, not humanism, as a positive term. This is a radical position which is difficult to sustain, but perhaps our only hope. It does not amount to the obscene madness of openly pursuing a terrorist and inhuman politics, but something much more difficult to think through. In contemporary post-deconstructionist thought, if one risks this ridiculous designation, which cannot but sound like its own parody, the term inhuman has gained new weight, especially through the work of Agamben and Badiou. The best way to approach it is via Freud's reluctance to endorse the injunction, love thy neighbor. The temptation to be resisted here is the ethical prettification of the neighbor that we have already noted in the work of Emmanuel Levinas. In a properly dialectical paradox, what Levinas, with all his celebration of otherness, fails to take into account is not some underlying sameness of all humans, but radically inhuman otherness itself. The otherness of a human being reduced to inhumanity. The otherness exemplified by the terrifying figure of the Musulman, the living dead, in the concentration camps. At a different level, the same goes for Stalinist communism. In the standard Stalinist narrative, even the concentration camps were a locus of the fight against fascism, where imprisoned communists were organizing networks of heroic resistance. In such a universe, of course, there is no place for the limit experience of the Musulman, of the living dead deprived of the capacity for human engagement. No wonder that Stalinist communists were so eager to normalize the camps into just another site of the anti-fascist struggle, dismissing the Musulmaner as simply those who were too weak to endure the struggle. It is against this backdrop that one can understand why Lacan speaks of the inhuman core of the neighbor. Back in the 1960s, the era of structuralism, Louis Althusser launched the notorious formula of theoretical anti-humanism, demanding even, that it be supplemented by practical humanism. In our practice, we should act as humanists, respecting the others, treating them as free persons with full dignity, creators of their world. However, in theory, we should equally always bear in mind that humanism is an ideology, the way we spontaneously experience our predicament, and that true knowledge of humans and their history should treat individuals not as autonomous subjects, but as elements in a structure which follows its own laws. In contrast to Althusser, Lacan accomplishes the passage from theoretical to practical anti-humanism, that is, to an ethics that goes beyond the dimension of what Nietzsche called the human all too human, and confronts the inhuman core of humanity. This does not only mean an ethics which no longer denies, but fearlessly takes into account the latent monstrosity of being human, the diabolical dimension which exploded in phenomena usually covered by the concept name Auschwitz. An ethics that would be still possible after Auschwitz, to paraphrase Adorno. This inhuman dimension is for Lacan, at the same time, the ultimate bedrock of ethics. In philosophical terms, this inhuman dimension can be defined as that of a subject subtracted from all forms of human individuality or personality, which is why, in contemporary popular culture, one of the exemplary figures of the pure subject is a non-human, alien, cyborg, who displays more fidelity to the task, more dignity and freedom than its human counterparts, from the Rutger Hauer android in Blade Runner to the Schwarzenegger figure in Terminator. It is against the background of this topic of the sovereign acceptance of death that one should reread the rhetorical turn often referred to as the proof of Robespierre's totalitarian manipulation of his audience. This turn took place in the midst of Robespierre's speech in the National Assembly on 11 Germinal Year 2, March 31st, 1794. The previous night, Danton, Camille Desmoulins, and some others had been arrested, so many members of the Assembly were understandably afraid that their turn would also come. Robespierre directly addresses the moment as pivotal. Citizens, the moment has come to speak the truth. He then goes on to evoke the fear floating in the room. One wants, on veut, to make you fear abuses of power, of the national power you have exercised. One wants to make us fear that the people will fall victim to the committees. One fears that the prisoners are being oppressed. The opposition is here between the impersonal one, the instigators of fear are not personified, and the collective, thus put under pressure, which almost imperceptibly shifts from the plural second person you, vous, to the first person us. Robespierre gallantly includes himself into the collective. However, the final formulation introduces an ominous twist. It is no longer that one wants to make you, us, fear, but that one fears, which means that the enemy stirring up fear is no longer outside you, us, members of the assembly. It is here, amongst us, amongst the you addressed by Robespierre, corroding our unity from within. At this precise moment, Robespierre, in a true master stroke, assumes full subjectivization. Waiting a little bit for the ominous effect of his words to be felt, he then continued in the first person singular. I say that anyone who trembles at this moment is guilty, for innocence never fears public scrutiny. What can be more totalitarian than this closed loop of your very fear of being guilty makes you guilty? A weird, superego twisted version of the well-known motto, the only thing to fear is fear itself. One should nonetheless move beyond the facile dismissal of Robespierre's rhetorical strategy as the strategy of terrorist culpabilization and discern its moment of truth. There are no innocent bystanders in the crucial moments of revolutionary decision, because in such moments innocence itself, exempting oneself from the decision, going on as if the struggle I am witnessing does not really concern me, is the highest treason. That is to say, the fear of being accused of treason is my treason, because even if I did not do anything against the revolution, this fear itself, the fact that it emerged in me, demonstrates that my subjective position is external to the revolution, that I experience the revolution as an external force threatening me. But what happens subsequently in this unique speech is even more revealing. Robespierre directly addresses the touchy question that has to arise in the mind of his public. How can he himself be sure that he will not be the next in line to be accused? He is not the master exempted from the collective, the I outside we. After all, he was once very close to Danton, a powerful figure now under arrest. So what if tomorrow his proximity to Danton will be used against him? In short, how can Robespierre be sure that the process he unleashed will not swallow him? It is here that his position achieves sublime greatness. He fully accepts that the danger that now threatens Danton will tomorrow threaten him. The reason that he is so serene, that he is not afraid of this fate, is not that Danton was a traitor, while he, Robespierre, is pure, a direct embodiment of the people's will. It is that he, Robespierre, is not afraid to die. His eventual death will be a mere accident, which counts for nothing. What does danger matter to me? My life belongs to the fatherland. My heart is free from fear, and if I were to die, I would do so without reproach and without ignominy. Consequently, insofar as the shift from we to I can effectively be determined as the moment when the democratic mask falls off, and when Robespierre openly asserts himself as a master, up to this point, we follow Lefort's analysis. The very term master has to be given here its full Hegelian weight. The master is the figure of sovereignty, the one who is not afraid to die, who is ready to risk everything. In other words, the ultimate meaning of Robespierre's first-person singular, I, is, I am not afraid to die. What authorizes him is simply this, not any kind of direct access to the big other. That is, he does not claim that he has direct access to the people's will which speaks through him. It is against this background that one should recall Mao Zedong's message to the hundreds of millions of downtrodden, a simple and touching message of courage. Do not be afraid of the big powers. Bigness is nothing to be afraid of. The big will be overthrown by the small will become big. The same message of courage sustains also Mao's infamous stance towards the prospect of a new atomic world war. We stand firmly for peace and against war, but if the imperialists insist on unleashing another war, we should not be afraid of it. Our attitude on this question is the same as our attitude towards any disturbance. First, we are against it. Second, we are not afraid of it. The First World War was followed by the birth of the Soviet Union, with a population of 200 million. The Second World War was followed by the emergence of the socialist camp, with a combined population of 900 million. If the imperialists insist on launching a Third World War, it is certain that several hundred million more will turn to socialism, and then there will not be much room left on earth for the imperialists. It is all too easy to dismiss these lines as the empty posturing of a leader ready to sacrifice millions for his political goals, the extension ad absurdum of Mao's ruthless decision to starve tens of millions to death in the late 1950s. The flip side of this dismissive attitude is the basic message: we should not be afraid. Is this not the only correct attitude apropos war? First, we are against it. Second, we are not afraid of it. The logic of Mao's argument is very precise here. His, although we are against war, we are not afraid of it, inverts the imperialists' true attitude, which is, although we are for war, we are afraid of it. Imperialists are Nietzschean slaves. They need wars, but are afraid to lose their possessions to which they are attached, while the proletarians are the true aristocratic masters who do not want war. They do not need it, but are not afraid of it because they have nothing to lose. Mao's argument goes on to its terrifying conclusion. The United States cannot annihilate the Chinese nation with its small stack of atom bombs. Even if the US atom bombs were so powerful that, when dropped on China, they would make a hole right through the Earth, or even blow it up, that would hardly mean anything to the universe as a whole, though it might be a major event for the solar system. There is obviously an inhuman madness in this argument. Is the fact that the destruction of planet Earth would hardly mean anything to the universe as a whole, not rather poor solace for the extinction of humanity? The argument only works if, in a Kantian way, one presupposes a pure transcendental subject unaffected by this catastrophe, a subject which, although non-existent in reality, is operative as a virtual point of reference. Recall Husserl's dark dream from his Cartesian meditations of how the transcendental cogito would remain unaffected by a plague that would annihilate all humanity. It is easy, apropos this example, to score cheap points about the self-destructive background of transcendental subjectivity, and about how Husserl misses the paradox of what Foucault, in his Les mots et les choses, called the transcendental empirical doublet, of the link that forever attaches the transcendental ego to the empirical ego, so that the annihilation of the latter, by definition, leads to the disappearance of the first. However, what if fully recognizing this dependence as a fact, and nothing more than this, a bald fact of being, one nonetheless insists on the truth of its negation, the truth of the assertion of the independence of the subject with regard to the empirical individuals qua living beings? Che Guevara approached the same line of thought when, in the midst of the unbearable tension of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he advocated a fearless approach of risking the New World War, which would involve, at the very least, the total annihilation of the Cuban people. He praised the heroic readiness of the Cuban people to risk its own disappearance. Again, there is definitely something terrifying about this attitude. However, this terror is nothing less than the condition of freedom. This is how Yamamoto Joko, a Zen priest, described the proper attitude of a warrior. Every day, without fail, he should consider himself as dead. There is a saying of the elders that goes, "Step from under the eaves and you're a dead man. Leave the gate and the enemy is waiting." This is not a matter of being careful. It is to consider oneself as dead beforehand. This is why, according to Hillis Lowry, many Japanese soldiers in World War II performed their own funerals before leaving for the battlefield. Many of the soldiers in the present war are so determined to die on the battlefield that they conduct their own public funerals before leaving for the front. This holds no element of the ridiculous to the Japanese. Rather, it is admired as the spirit of the true samurai who enters the battle with no thought of return. This preemptive self-exclusion from the domain of the living, of course, turns the soldier into a properly sublime figure. Instead of dismissing this feature as part of fascistic militarism, one should assert it as also constitutive of a radical revolutionary position, which, as Seneca put it long ago in his Oedipus, demands of the subject to search for a way to wonder without mixing with the dead, and yet removed from the living. When, in the flashback scene from Bryan Singer's The Usual Suspects, the mysterious Kaiser Soze returns home and finds his wife and small daughter held at gunpoint by the members of a rival mob, he shoots his wife and daughter dead, and then declares that he will pursue the members of the rival gang mercilessly, tracking down their parents, families, and friends in order to kill them all. In a situation of a forced choice, the Soze subject makes the crazy, impossible choice of, in a way, striking at himself, at what is most precious to him. And this act, far from amounting to a case of impotent aggression turned towards oneself, rather changes the coordinates of the situation in which the subject found himself. By way of cutting himself loose from the precious object through whose possession the enemy kept him in check, the subject gains the space for a free act. The price of this freedom is, of course, terrible. The only way for the subject to neutralize the guilt of sacrificing his most precious objects is to turn himself into a king of the living dead, to renounce all personal idiosyncrasies and pleasures, and to dedicate his entire life to destroying all those who forced him to perform the sacrificial act. Such an inhuman position of absolute freedom. In my loneliness, I am free to do whatever I want. Nobody has any hold over me. Coinciding with absolute subjection to a task, the only purpose of my life is to enact vengeance, is what perhaps characterizes the revolutionary subject at its innermost. Another inhuman dimension of the couple virtue-terror promoted by Robespierre is the rejection of habit, in the sense of the agency of realistic compromises. Every legal order, or every order of explicit normativity, has to rely on a complex reflexive network of informal rules which tells us how we are to relate to the explicit norms, how we are to apply them, to what extent we are to take them literally, how and when are we allowed, solicited even, to disregard them, and so on. And this is the domain of habit. To know the habits of a society is to know the meta-rules of how to apply its explicit norms, when to use them or not to use them, when to violate them, when not to choose what is offered, when we are effectively obliged to do something but have to pretend that we are doing it as a free choice, as in the case of potlatch. Let us refer to the polite offer meant to be refused. It is a habit to refuse such an offer, and anyone who accepts such an offer commits a vulgar blunder. The same goes for many political situations in which a choice is given on condition that we make the right choice. We are solemnly reminded that we can say no, but we are expected to reject this offer and enthusiastically say yes. With many sexual prohibitions, the situation is the opposite. The explicit no effectively functions as the implicit injunction, do it but in a discreet way. Measured against this background, revolutionary egalitarian figures from Robespierre to John Brown are, potentially at least, figures without habits. They refuse to take into account the habits that qualify the functioning of a universal rule. Such is the natural dominion of habit that we regard the most arbitrary conventions, sometimes indeed the most effective institutions, as absolute measures of truth or falsehood, justice or injustice. It does not even occur to us that most are inevitably still connected with the prejudices on which despotism fed us. We have been so long stooped under its yoke that we have some difficulty in raising ourselves to the eternal principles of reason. Anything that refers to the sacred source of all law seems to us to take on an illegal character, and the very order of nature seems to us a disorder. The majestic movements of a great people, the sublime fervours of virtue, often appear to our timid eyes as something like an erupting volcano or the overthrow of political society. And it is certainly not the least of the troubles bothering us, this contradiction between the weakness of our morals, the depravity of our minds, and the purity of principle and energy of character demanded by the free government to which we have dared to aspire. To break the yoke of habit means, if all men are equal, then all men are to be effectively treated as equal. If blacks are also human, they should be immediately treated as such. Let us recall the early stages of the struggle against slavery in the US, which, even prior to the Civil War, culminated in the armed conflict between the gradualism of compassionate liberals and the unique figure of John Brown. African Americans were caricatures of people. They were characterized as buffoons and minstrels. They were the butt end of jokes in American society. And even the abolitionists, as anti-slavery as they were, the majority of them did not see African Americans as equals. The majority of them, and this was something that African Americans complained about all the time, were willing to work for the end of slavery in the South, but they were not willing to work to end discrimination in the North. John Brown wasn't like that. For him, practicing egalitarianism was a first step toward ending slavery, and African Americans who came in contact with him knew this immediately. He made it very clear that he saw no difference, and he didn't make this clear by saying it. He made it clear by what he did. For this reason, John Brown is a key political figure in the history of the US. In his fervently Christian radical abolitionism, he came closest to introducing the Jacobin logic into the American political landscape. John Brown considered himself a complete egalitarian, and it was very important for him to practice egalitarianism on every level. He made it very clear that he saw no difference, and he didn't make this clear by saying it, he made it clear by what he did. Even today, long after slavery has been abolished, Brown is the polarizing figure in American collective memory. Those whites who support Brown are all the more precious. Among them, surprisingly, Henry David Thoreau, the great opponent of violence. Against the standard dismissal of Brown as bloodthirsty, foolish, and insane, Thoreau painted a portrait of a peerless man whose embracement of a cause was unparalleled. He even goes as far as to liken Brown's execution. He states that he regards Brown as dead before his actual death, to Christ. Thoreau vents his rage at the scores of those who voiced their scorn for John Brown. They could not understand Brown due to their concrete stances and dead existences. They are not truly alive. Only a handful of men can be said to have lived. It is, however, this very consistent egalitarianism which also constitutes the limitation of Jacobin politics. Recall Marx's fundamental insight about the bourgeois limitation of the logic of equality. Capitalist inequalities, exploitation, are not the unprincipled violations of the principle of equality, but are absolutely inherent to the logic of equality. They are the paradoxical result of its consistent realization. What we have in mind here is not only the wearisome old motif of how market exchange presupposes formally, legally equal subjects who meet and interact in the market. The crucial moment of Marx's critique of bourgeois socialists is that capitalist exploitation does not involve any kind of unequal exchange between the worker and the capitalist. This exchange is fully equal and just. Ideally, in principle, the worker gets paid the full value of the commodity he is selling, his labor power. Of course, radical bourgeois revolutionaries are aware of this limitation. However, the way they try to counteract it is through a direct terroristic imposition of more and more de facto equality, equal salaries, equal access to health services, which can only be imposed through new forms of formal inequality, different sorts of preferential treatments for the underprivileged. In short, the axiom of equality means either not enough, it remains the abstract form of actual inequality, or too much, in force, terroristic equality. It is a formalistic notion in a strict dialectical sense. That is, its limitation is precisely that its form is not concrete enough, but a mere neutral container of some content that eludes this form. The problem here is not terror as such. Our task today is precisely to reinvent emancipatory terror. The problem lies elsewhere. Egalitarian political extremism, or excessive radicalism, should always be read as a phenomenon of ideologico-political displacement, as an index of its opposite, of a limitation, of a refusal, effectively, to go to the end. What was the Jacobins' recourse to radical terror, if not a kind of hysterical acting out, bearing witness to their inability to disturb the very fundamentals of economic order, private property, etc.? And does the same not go even for the so-called excesses of political correctness? Do they also not display the retreat from disturbing the effective economic and other causes of racism and sexism? Perhaps, then, the time has come to render problematic the standard topos, shared by practically all postmodern leftists, according to which political totalitarianism somehow results from the predominance of material production and technology over intersubjective communication and/or symbolic practice, as if the root of political terror resides in the fact that the principle of instrumental reason, of the technological exploitation of nature, is extended also to society, so that people are treated as raw stuff to be transformed into new men. What if it is the exact opposite which holds? What if political terror signals precisely that the sphere of material production is denied its autonomy and subordinated to political logic? Is it not that all political terror, from the Jacobins to the Maoist Cultural Revolution, presupposes the foreclosure of production proper, its reduction to the terrain of the political struggle. In other words, what such a postmodern perspective effectively amounts to is nothing less than the abandonment of Marx's key insight into how the political struggle is a spectacle which, in order to be deciphered, has to be referred to the sphere of the economy. If Marxism had any analytical value for political theory, was it not in the insistence that the problem of freedom was contained in the social relations implicitly declared unpolitical, that is, naturalized, in liberal discourse? It is at this level that one should search for the decisive moment of a revolutionary process. Say, in the case of the October Revolution, not the explosion of 1917 to 18, not even the civil war that followed, but the intense experimentation of the early 1920s, the desperate, often ridiculous attempts to invent new rituals of daily life, how to replace the pre-revolutionary marriage and funeral rituals, how to organize the most commonplace interaction in a factory, in an apartment block. It is at this level of what, as opposed to the abstract terror of the great political revolution, one is tempted to call the concrete terror of imposing a new order on quotidian reality, that the Jacobins and both the Soviet and the Chinese revolutions ultimately failed, not for lack of attempts in this direction for sure. The Jacobins were at their best not in the theatrics of terror, but in the utopian explosions of political imagination apropos the reorganization of the everyday. Everything was there, proposed in the course of the frantic activity condensed into a couple of years, from the self-organization of women to communal homes in which the old were to be able to spend their last years in peace and dignity. The harsh consequence to be accepted here is that this excess of egalitarian democracy over and above democratic procedure can only institutionalize itself in the guise of its opposite, as revolutionary democratic terror. Transubstantiations of Marxism. In modern history, the politics of revolutionary terror casts its shadow over the epoch which spans from Robespierre to Mao, or, more generally, the disintegration of the Communist bloc in 1990. Its last installment was the Maoist Cultural Revolution. Obviously, the socio-historical context had changed radically between the French Revolution and the Cultural Revolution. To put it in Platonist terms, what unites the two is precisely and only the same eternal idea of revolutionary justice. In the case of Mao, the question is even whether one can legitimately count him as a Marxist, since the social base of the Maoist revolution was not the working class. One of the most devious traps which lurk for Marxist theorists is the search for the moment of the fall, when things took the wrong turning in the history of Marxism. Was it already the late Engels, with his more positivist evolutionary understanding of historical materialism? Was it the revisionism and the orthodoxy of the Second International? Was it Lenin, or was it Marx himself in his late works, after he had abandoned his youthful humanism, as some humanist Marxists claimed decades ago? This entire trope has to be rejected. There is no opposition here. The fall is to be inscribed in the very origins. To put it even more pointedly, such a search for the intruder who infected the original model and set in motion its degeneration cannot but reproduce the logic of anti-Semitism. What this means is that even if, or rather especially if, one submits the Marxist path to ruthless critique, one has first to acknowledge it as one's own, taking full responsibility for it, not to comfortably reject the bad side of things by attributing it to a foreign element, the bad Engels who was too stupid to understand Marx's dialectics, the bad Lenin who did not grasp the core of Marxist theory, the bad Stalin who spoilt the noble plans of the good Lenin, and so on. The first thing we must do is to fully endorse the displacement in the history of Marxism concentrated in two great passages, or rather, violent cuts. The passage from Marx to Lenin, as well as the passage from Lenin to Mao. In each case, there is a displacement of the original constellation. From the most advanced country, as Marx expected, to a relatively backward country, the revolution took place in the wrong country. From workers to poor peasants as the main revolutionary agent. In the same way as Christ needed Paul's betrayal in order for Christianity to emerge as a universal church, recall that, amongst the 12 apostles, Paul occupies the place of Judas the traitor, replacing him. Marx needed Lenin's betrayal in order to enact the first Marxist revolution. It is an inner necessity of the original teaching to submit to and survive this betrayal, to survive this violent act of being torn out of one's original context and thrown into a foreign landscape where it has to reinvent itself. Only in this way is universality born. So, apropos the second violent transposition, that of Mao, it is too easy either to condemn his reinvention of Marxism as theoretically inadequate, as a regression with regard to Marxist standards. It is easy to show that peasants lack substanceless proletarian subjectivity, but it is equally too facile to blur the violence of the cut and to accept Mao's reformulation as a logical continuation or application of Marxism, relying, as is usually the case, on the simple metaphoric expansion of class struggle. Today's predominant class struggle is no longer between capitalists and proletariat in each country. It has shifted to the third versus the first world, bourgeois versus proletarian nations. The achievement of Mao is here tremendous. His name stands for the political mobilization of the hundreds of millions of anonymous third world layers whose labor provided the invisible substance, the background of historical development. The mobilization of all those whom even such a poet of otherness as Levinas dismissed as the yellow peril, as we see in what is arguably his weirdest text, the Russo-Chinese debate and the dialectic, 1960, a comment on the Soviet-Chinese conflict. The yellow peril, it is not racial, it is spiritual. It does not involve inferior values, it involves a radical strangeness, a stranger to the weight of its past, from where there does not filter any familiar voice or inflection, a lunar or Martian past. Does this not recall Heidegger's insistence throughout the 1930s that the main task of Western thought today was to defend the Greek breakthrough, the founding gesture of the West, the overcoming of the pre-philosophical, mythical, Asiatic universe, to struggle against the renewed Asiatic threat? The greatest adversary of the West was the mythical in general, and the Asiatic in particular. It is this Asiatic radical strangeness which is mobilized, politicized, by Mao Zedong's communist movement. In his Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel introduces his notorious notion of womankind as the everlasting irony of the community. Womankind changes by intrigue the universal end of the government into a private end, transforms its universal activity into a work of some particular individual, and perverts the universal property of the state into a possession and ornament for the family. In contrast to male ambition, a woman wants power in order to promote her own narrow family interests, or, even worse, her personal caprice, incapable as she is of perceiving the universal dimension of state politics. How are we not to recall F.W.J. Schelling's claim that the same principle carries and holds us in its ineffectiveness, which will consume and destroy us in its effectiveness? A power which, when it is kept in its proper place, can be benign and pacifying, turns into its radical opposite, into the most destructive fury, the moment it intervenes at a higher level, the level of which is not its own. The same femininity, which, within the closed circle of family life, is the power of protective love, turns into obscene frenzy when displayed at the level of public and state affairs. In short, it is acceptable for a woman to protest against public state power on behalf of the rights of the family and kinship, but woe to a society in which women endeavor directly to influence decisions concerning the affairs of state, manipulating their weak male partners, effectively emasculating them. Is there not something similar in the terror aroused by the prospect of the awakening of the anonymous Asian masses? They are fine if they protest at their fate and allow us to help them through large-scale humanitarian activity, but not when they empower themselves, to the horror of sympathetic liberals, always ready to support the revolt of the poor and dispossessed, so long as it is done with good manners. Georgi M. de Luguin's Borgia's Secret Admirer in the Caucasus tells the extraordinary story of Musa Shanib from Abkhazia, the leading intellectual of this turbulent region, whose incredible career passed from Soviet dissident intellectual through democratic political reformer and Muslim fundamentalist war leader up to respected professor of philosophy, his entire career marked by a strange admiration for Pierre Bourdieu's thought. There are two ways to approach such a figure. The first reaction is to dismiss it as a local eccentricity, to treat it with benevolent irony. What a strange choice, Bourdieu. Who knows what this folkloric guy sees in Bourdieu? The second reaction is to directly assert the universal scope of theory. See how universal theory is. Every intellectual from Paris to Chechnya and Abkhazia can debate Bourdieu's concepts. The true task, of course, is to avoid both these options and to assert the universality of a theory as the result of hard theoretical work and struggle, a struggle that is not external to theory. The position is not only that Shanib had to do a lot of work to break the constraints of his local context and grasp Bourdieu. This appropriation of Bourdieu by an Abkhazian intellectual also affects the substance of the theory itself, transposing it into a different universe. Did, mutatis mutandis, Lenin not do something similar with Marx? The shift of Mao with regard to Lenin and Stalin concerns the relationship between the working class and the peasantry. Both Lenin and Stalin were deeply distrustful of the peasantry. They saw breaking the inertia of the peasantry as one of the main tasks of Soviet power, to uproot their substantial attachment to land, to proletarianize them, and thus fully expose them to the dynamics of modernization. In clear contrast to Mao, who, as we have noted, in his critical notes on Stalin's economic problems of socialism in the USSR from 1958, remarked that Stalin's point of view is almost altogether wrong. The basic error is his mistrust of the peasants. The theoretical and political consequences of this shift are properly shattering. They imply no less than a thorough reworking of Marx's Hegelian notion of the position of the proletariat as that of substanceless subjectivity, of those who are reduced to the abyss of their subjectivity. As is well known by those who still remember their Marxism, the ambiguous central point of its theoretical structure concerns its premise that capitalism itself creates the conditions for its transcendence through proletarian revolution. How are we to read this? Is it to be read in a linear evolutionary way? Revolution should take place when capitalism fully develops all its potential and exhausts all its possibilities, the mythical point at which it confronts its central antagonism, contradiction, at its purest, in its naked form. And is it enough to add the subjective aspect, and to emphasize that the working class should not just sit and wait for the ripe moment, but educate itself through long struggle? As is also well known, Lenin's theory of the weakest link in the chain is a kind of compromise solution. Although it accepts that the first revolution can take place, not in the most developed country, but in a country in which the antagonisms of capitalist development are most aggravated, even if it is less developed, Russia, which combined concentrated modern capitalist industrial islands with agrarian backwardness and pre-democratic authoritarian government, it still perceived the October Revolution as a risky breakthrough, which could only succeed if it was soon accompanied by a large-scale Western European revolution. All eyes were focused on Germany in this respect. The radical abandonment of this model occurred only with Mao, for whom the proletarian revolution should take place in the less developed part of the world, among the wide masses of the Third World's impoverished peasants, workers, and even the patriotic bourgeoisie, who were exposed to the aftershocks of capitalist globalization, organizing their rage and despair. In a total reversal, perversion even, of Marx's model, the class struggle is thus reformulated as the struggle between First World bourgeois nations and Third World proletarian nations. The paradox here is properly dialectical, perhaps in the ultimate application of Mao's teaching on contradictions. Its very underdevelopment, and thus unripeness for the revolution, makes a country ripe for the revolution. Since, however, such unripe economic conditions do not allow the construction of properly post-capitalist socialism, the necessary correlate is the assertion of the primacy of politics over economics. The victorious revolutionary subject does not act as an instrument of economic necessity, liberating its potential, whose further development is thwarted by capitalist contradictions. It is, rather, a voluntarist agent which acts against spontaneous economic necessity, imposing its vision on reality through revolutionary terror. One should bear in mind here the fundamental lesson of Hegelian concrete universality. Universal necessity is not a teleological force which, operative from the outset, pulls the strings and runs the process, guaranteeing its happy outcome. On the contrary, this universal necessity is always retroactive. It emerges out of the radical contingency of the process and signals the moment of the contingency's self-Aufhebung. One should thus say that once the contingent passage from Leninism to Maoism took place, it cannot but appear as necessary. That is, one can reconstruct the inner necessity of Maoism as the next stage of the development of Marxism. In order to grasp this reversal of contingency into necessity, one should leave behind the standard linear historical time structured as the realization of possibilities. At the temporal moment X, there are multiple possible directions history can take, and what actually takes place is the realization of one of the possibilities. What this linear time is unable to grasp is the paradox of a contingent actual emergency, which retroactively creates its own possibility. Only when the thing takes place can we see how it was possible. The rather tiresome debate about the origins of Maoism, or Stalinism, oscillates around three main options. 1. The hard anti-communists and the hard partisans of Stalinism claim that there is a direct immanent logic which leads from Marx to Lenin and from Lenin to Stalin, and then from Stalin to Mao. 2. The soft critics claim that the Stalinist, or prior to it Leninist turn, is one of the historical possibilities present in Marx's theoretical structure. It could have turned out otherwise, but the Stalinist catastrophe is nonetheless inscribed as an option into the original theory itself. 3. Finally, the defenders of the purity of the original teaching of Marx dismiss Stalinism, or indeed Leninism, as a simple distortion, betrayal, insisting on the radical break between the two. Lenin and or Stalin simply kidnapped Marxist theory and used it for purposes totally at odds with Marx. One should reject all three versions as based on the same underlying linear historicist notion of temporality, and opt for the fourth version, beyond the false question to what extent was Marx responsible for the Stalinist catastrophe. Marx is entirely responsible, but retroactively. That is, the same holds for Stalin as for Kafka in Borges's famous formulation. They both created their own predecessors. This is the movement of concrete universality, this radical transubstantiation through which the original theory has to reinvent itself in a new context. Only by way of surviving this transplantation can it emerge as effectively universal. And, of course, the point is not that we are dealing here with the pseudo-Hegelian process of alienation and disalienation, of how the original theory is alienated and then has to incorporate the foreign context, reappropriate it, subordinate it to itself. What such a pseudo-Hegelian notion misses is the way this violent transplantation into a new context radically affects the original theory itself, so that when this theory returns to itself and its otherness, reinvents itself in the foreign context, its very substance changes. And yet this shift is not just the reaction to an external shock. It remains an inherent transformation of the same theory of the overcoming of capitalism. This is how capitalism is a concrete universality. It is not the question of isolating what all the particular forms of capitalism have in common, their shared universal features, but of grasping this matrix as a positive force in itself, as something which all actual particular forms try to counteract. the destructive effects of which they strive to contain. The limits of Mao's dialectics. The most reliable sign of capitalism's ideological triumph is the virtual disappearance of the very term over the last 2 or 3 decades. In the 1980s, virtually no one, with the exception of a few allegedly archaic Marxists, an endangered species, referred to capitalism any longer. The term was simply struck from the vocabulary of politicians, trade unionists, writers, and journalists, not to mention social scientists, who had consigned it to historical oblivion. So what about the upsurge of the anti-globalization movement over the last few years? Does it not clearly contradict this diagnostic? Not at all. A close examination quickly demonstrates that this movement also succumbs to the temptation to transform a critique of capitalism itself, centered on economic mechanisms, forms of work organization, and profit extraction, into a critique of imperialism. In this way, when one talks about globalization and its agents, the enemy is externalized, often in the form of vulgar anti-Americanism. From this perspective, the main task today is to fight the American empire, and any ally is fine if it is anti-American. Thus, unbridled Chinese communist capitalism, violent Islamist anti-modernism, as well as the obscene Lukashenko regime in Belarus, see Chavez's visit to Belarus in July 2006, may appear as progressive anti-globalist comrades in arms. What we have here is thus another version of the ill-famed notion of alternative modernity. Instead of the critique of capitalism as such, instead of confronting its basic mechanism, we have the critique of the imperialist excess, with the tacit idea of mobilizing capitalist mechanisms within another, more progressive framework. This is how one should approach what is arguably Mao's central contribution to Marxist philosophy, his elaborations on the notion of contradiction. One should not dismiss them as a worthless philosophical regression, which, as one can easily demonstrate, relies on a vague notion of contradiction, which simply means struggle of opposing tendencies. The main thesis of his great text on contradiction regarding the 2 facets of contradiction, the principal and the non-principal contradictions in a process, and the principal and non-principal aspects of a contradiction, deserves a close reading. Mao's reproach to the dogmatic Marxists is that they do not understand that it is precisely in the particularity of contradiction that the universality of contradiction resides. For instance, in capitalist society, the 2 forces in contradiction, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, form the principal contradiction. The other contradictions, such as those between the remnant feudal class and the bourgeoisie, between the peasant petty bourgeoisie and the bourgeoisie, between the proletariat and the peasant petty bourgeoisie, between the non-monopoly capitalists and the monopoly capitalists, between bourgeois democracy and bourgeois fascism, among the capitalist countries, and between imperialism and the colonies, are all determined or influenced by this principal contradiction. When imperialism launches a war of aggression against such a country, all its various classes, except for some traitors, can temporarily unite in a national war against imperialism. At such a time, the contradiction between imperialism and the country concerned becomes the principal contradiction, while all the contradictions among the various classes within the country, including what was the principal contradiction between the feudal system and the great masses of the people, are temporarily relegated to a secondary and subordinate position. This is Mao's key point. The principal, universal contradiction does not overlap with the contradiction which should be treated as dominant in a particular situation. The universal dimension literally resides in this particular contradiction. In each concrete situation, a different particular contradiction is the predominant one, in the precise sense that in order to win the battle for the resolution of the principal contradiction, one should treat a particular contradiction as the predominant one, to which all other struggles should be subordinated. In China, under Japanese occupation, patriotic unity against the Japanese was the predominant feature if communists wanted to win in the class struggle. In these conditions, any direct focus on class struggle harms the class struggle itself. Therein, perhaps, resides the main feature of dogmatic opportunism, to insist on the centrality of the principal contradiction at the wrong moment. The further key point concerns the principal aspect of the contradiction. For example, with regard to the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production. The productive forces, practice, and the economic base generally play the principal and decisive role. Whoever denies this is not a materialist. But it must also be admitted that in certain conditions, such aspects as the relations of production, theory, and the superstructure in turn manifest themselves in the principal and decisive role. When it is impossible for the productive forces to develop without a change in the relations of production, then the change in the relations of production plays the principal and decisive role. The political stakes of this debate are decisive. Mao's aim is to assert the key role in the political struggle of what the Marxist tradition usually refers to as the subjective factor, theory, the superstructure. This is what, according to Mao, Stalin neglected. Stalin's Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, from first to last, says nothing about the superstructure. It is not concerned with people. It considers things, not people. It speaks only of the production relations, not of the superstructure, nor politics, nor the role of the people. Communism cannot be reached unless there is a communist movement. Alain Badiou, a true Maoist here, applies this to the contemporary constellation, avoiding the focus on the anti-capitalist struggle, even ridiculing its main form today, the anti-globalization movement, and defining the emancipatory struggle in strictly political terms as the struggle against liberal democracy, today's predominant ideologico-political form. Today, the enemy is not called empire or capital. It's called democracy. What today prevents the radical questioning of capitalism itself is precisely the belief in the democratic form of the struggle against capitalism. Lenin's stance against economism, as well as against pure politics, is crucial today, apropos the split attitude towards the economy in what remains of the left. On the one hand, the pure politicians abandon the economy as the site of struggle and intervention. On the other hand, the economists, fascinated by the functioning of the contemporary global economy, preclude any possibility of a political intervention proper. With regard to this split, today, more than ever, we should return to Lenin. Yes, the economy is the key domain. The battle will be decided there. One has to break the spell of global capitalism. But the intervention should be properly political, not economic. Today, when everyone is anti-capitalist, up to and including the Hollywood socio-critical conspiracy movies, from The Enemy of the State to The Insider, in which the enemy are the big corporations with their ruthless pursuit of profit, the signifier anti-capitalism has lost its subversive sting. What one should problematize is the self-evident opposite of this anti-capitalism, the trust in democracy by honest Americans who break up the conspiracy. This is the hard kernel of today's global capitalist universe, its true master signifier, democracy itself. Mao's further elaboration on the notional contradiction in his On the Correct Handling of Contradictions Among the People, 1957, also cannot be reduced to its best-known feature, the rather common-sense point of distinguishing between the antagonistic and the non-antagonistic contradictions. The contradictions between ourselves and the enemy are antagonistic contradictions. Within the ranks of the people, the contradictions among the working people are non-antagonistic, while those between the exploited and the exploiting classes have a non-antagonistic as well as an antagonistic aspect. Under the people's democratic dictatorship, two different methods, one dictatorial and the other democratic, should be used to resolve the two types of contradictions which differ in nature, those between ourselves and the enemy, and those among the people. One should always read this distinction together with its more ominous supplement, a warning that the two aspects may overlap. In ordinary circumstances, contradictions among the people are not antagonistic, But if they are not handled properly, or if we relax our vigilance and lower our guard, antagonism may arise. Democratic dialogue, the peaceful coexistence of different orientations in the working class, is not something that is simply given, a natural state of things. It is something that is won and sustained by vigilance and struggle. Here, too, struggle has priority over unity. The very space of unity has to be won through struggle. So what are we to do with these elaborations? One should be very precise in diagnosing, at the very abstract level of theory, where Mao was right and where he was wrong. Mao was right in rejecting the standard notion of dialectical synthesis as the reconciliation of the opposites, as a higher unity which encompasses their struggle. He was wrong in formulating this rejection, this insistence on the priority of struggle, of division, over every synthesis or unity, in terms of a general cosmology ontology of the eternal struggle of opposites. This is why he got caught up in the simplistic, properly non-dialectical notion of the bad infinity of struggle. Mao clearly regresses here to primitive pagan wisdoms on how every creature, every determinate form of life, sooner or later meets its end. One thing destroys another. Things emerge, develop, and are destroyed. Everywhere is like this. If things are not destroyed by others, then they destroy themselves. One should give Mao his due at this level. He pushes to the end in this direction, applying this principle to communism itself. See the following passage, in which Mao accomplishes a gigantic ontological leap forward from the division of the atomic nucleus into protons, antiprotons, and so on, to the inevitable division of communism into stages. I don't believe that communism will not be divided into stages, and that there will be no qualitative changes. Lenin said that all things can be divided. He gave the atom as an example, and said that not only can the atom be divided, but the electron too can be divided. Formerly, however, it was held that it could not be divided. The branch of science devoted to splitting the atomic nucleus is still very young, only 20 or 30 years old. In recent decades, the scientists have resolved the atomic nucleus into its constituents, such as protons, antiprotons, neutrons, antineutrons, mesons, and antimasons. He even goes a step further and moves beyond humanity itself, forecasting, in a proto-Nietzschean way, the overcoming of man. The life of dialectics is the continuous movement toward opposites. Mankind will also finally meet its doom. When the theologians talk about doomsday, they are pessimistic and terrify people. We say the end of mankind is something which will produce something more advanced than mankind. Mankind is still in its infancy. Moreover, he envisages the rise of some animals themselves to the, what we consider today as exclusively human, level of consciousness. In the future, animals will continue to develop. I don't believe that men alone are capable of having two hands. Can't horses, cows, sheep evolve? Can only monkeys evolve? And can it be, moreover, that of all the monkeys only one species can evolve, and all the others are incapable of evolving? In 1 million years, 10 million years, will horses, cows, and sheep still be the same as those today? I think they will continue to change. Horses, cows, sheep, and insects will all change. Two things should be added to this cosmic perspective. First, one should remember that Mao is here talking to the inner circle of party ideologists. This is what accounts for the tone of sharing a secret not to be rendered in public, as if Mao is divulging his secret teaching. And, in fact, Mao's speculations closely echo so-called biocosmism, the strange combination of vulgar materialism and Gnostic spirituality, which formed an occult shadow ideology, the obscene secret teaching of Soviet Marxism. Repressed from public sight during the main period of the Soviet state, biocosmism was openly propagated only in the first and in the last 2 decades of Soviet rule. Its main theses were the goals of religion, collective paradise, the overcoming of all suffering, full individual immortality, the resurrection of the dead, the victory over time and death, the conquest of space far beyond the solar system, can be realized in terrestrial life through the development of modern science and technology. In the future, not only will sexual difference be abolished, with the rise of chaste posthumans reproducing themselves through direct biotechnical reproduction, it will also be possible to resurrect all the dead of the past, establishing their biological formulae through their remains and then re-engendering them. DNA had not yet been heard of, thus even erasing all past injustices, undoing past suffering and destruction. In this bright biopolitical communist future, not only humans but also animals, all living beings, will participate in a directly collectivized reason of the cosmos. Whatever one may say against Lenin's ruthless critique of Maxim Gorky's God-building, Bogograditelstva, the direct deification of man, one should bear in mind that Gorky himself collaborated with biocosmists. It is interesting to note resemblances between this biocosmism and contemporary techno-gnosis. Second, this cosmic perspective is for Mao not just an irrelevant philosophical caveat. It has precise ethico-political consequences. When Mao high-handedly dismisses the threat of the atomic bomb, he is not downplaying the scope of the danger. He is fully aware that such a war may lead to the extinction of humanity as such. So, to justify his defiance, he has to adopt the cosmic perspective, from which the end of life on Earth would hardly mean anything to the universe as a whole. This cosmic perspective also grounds Mao's dismissive attitude towards the human costs of economic and political endeavors. If one is to believe the latest biography of Mao, he caused the greatest famine in history by exporting food to Russia to buy atomic and other types of arms. 38 million people starved or were slave-driven to death in 1958-61. Mao supposedly knew exactly what was happening, saying, "Half of China may well have to die." This is the instrumental attitude at its most radical. Killing as part of a ruthless attempt to realize a goal, reducing people to disposable means. And what one should bear in mind is that the Nazi Holocaust was not the same. The murder of the Jews was not part of a rational strategy, but was autotelic, a meticulously planned, irrational excess. Recall the deportation of the last Jews from the Greek islands in 1944, just before the German retreat, or the massive use of trains for transporting Jews instead of war materiel in 1944. This is why Heidegger was wrong when he reduced the Holocaust to the industrial production of corpses. It was not that. Stalinist communism rather could be characterized better in this way. The conceptual consequence of this bad infinity that pertains to vulgar evolutionism is Mao's consistent rejection of the negation as a universal dialectical law. Thus the explicit polemic against Engels, incidentally following Stalin, who, in his On Dialectical and Historical Materialism, also does not mention the negation of the negation among the four main features of Marxist dialectics. Engels talked about the three categories, but as for me, I don't believe in two of those categories. The unity of opposites is the most basic law. The transformation of quality and quantity into one another is the unity of the opposites, quality and quantity. And the negation of the negation does not exist at all. There is no such thing as the negation of the negation. Affirmation, negation, affirmation, negation. In the development of things, every link in the chain of events is both affirmation and negation. Slaveholding society negated primitive society, but with reference to feudal society, it constituted, in turn, the affirmation. Feudal society constituted the negation in relation to slaveholding society, but it was in turn the affirmation with reference to capitalist society. Capitalist society was the negation in relation to feudal society, but it is in turn the affirmation in relation to socialist society. Along similar lines, Mao scathingly dismissed the category of the dialectical synthesis of opposites, promoting his own version of negative dialectics. Every synthesis was for him ultimately what Adorno, in his critique of Lukács, called erpresste Versöhnung, enforced reconciliation, at best a momentary pause in the ongoing struggle, which occurs not when the opposites are united, but when one side simply wins over the other. What is synthesis? You have all witnessed how the two opposites, the Kuomintang and the Communist Party, were synthesized on the mainland. The synthesis took place like this. Their armies came, and we devoured them. We ate them bite by bite. One thing eating another, big fish eating little fish. This is synthesis. It has never been put like this in books. I have never put it this way in my books either. For his part, Yang Xianchen believes that two combine into one, and that synthesis is the indissoluble tie between two opposites. What indissoluble ties are there in this world? Things may be tied, but in the end they must be severed. There is nothing which cannot be severed. Note, again, the tone of sharing a secret not to be rendered public, the cruel realistic lesson that undermines the happy public optimism. This was at the core of the famous debate in the late 1950s about the one and the two. Are the two united into one, or is the one divided into two? In any given thing, the unity of opposites is conditional, temporary, and transitory, and hence relative, whereas the struggle of opposites is absolute. This brings us to what one is tempted to call Mao's ethico-political injunction. To paraphrase the last word of Beckett's L'Annonable, in the silence you don't know, you must go on severing. I can't go on. I'll go on severing. The paradox of Mao's radical politics, of the eternally ongoing division, which never reaches the final point of peace, is that it rejoins its opposite, the rightist social democratic revision whose founder Bernstein proposed the well-known formula. The goal is nothing. The movement is everything. So where does Mao fall short here? In the way he opposes this injunction to sever, to divide, to dialectical synthesis. When Mao mockingly refers to synthesizing as the destruction of the enemy or his subordination, his mistake resides in this very mocking attitude. He does not see that this is the true Hegelian synthesis. After all, what is the Hegelian negation of the negation? First, the old order is negated within its own ideological-political form. Then, this form itself has to be negated. Those who vacillate, those who are afraid to take the second step of overcoming this form itself, are those who, to repeat Robespierre, want a revolution without a revolution. And Lenin displays all the strength of his hermeneutics of suspicion in discerning the different forms of this retreat. The true victory, the true negation of the negation, occurs when the enemy talks your language. In this sense, a true victory is a victory in defeat. It occurs when one specific message is accepted as a universal framework, even by the enemy. For example, in the case of rational science versus belief, the true victory of science takes place when the church starts to defend itself in the language of science. Or in the contemporary politics of the UK, as many a perspicuous commentator has observed, the Thatcher Revolution was in itself chaotic, impulsive, marked by unpredictable contingencies, and it was only the third-way Blairite government that was able to institutionalize it, to stabilize it into new institutional forms, or, to put it in Hegelese, to raise what first appeared as a contingency, a historical accident, into necessity. In this sense, Blair repeated Thatcherism, elevating it into a concept, in the same way that, for Hegel, Augustus repeated Caesar, transforming, sublating a contingent, personal name into a concept, a title. Thatcher was not a Thatcherite, she was just herself. It was only Blair, more than John Major, who truly forged Thatcherism as a notion. The dialectical irony of history is that only a nominal ideological-political enemy can do this to you, can elevate you into a concept. The imperial instigator has to be knocked off. Julius Caesar had to be murdered. Thatcher had to be ignominiously deposed. This is the surprising lesson of the last decades, the lesson of West European third-way social democracy, but also the lesson of the Chinese communists presiding over what is arguably the most explosive development of capitalism in the entirety of human history. We can do it better. Recall the classical Marxist account of the overcoming of capitalism. Capitalism unleashed the breathtaking dynamics of self-enhancing productivity. In capitalism, all that is solid melts into air. Capitalism is the greatest revolutionizer in the history of humanity. On the other hand, this capitalist dynamic is propelled by its own inner obstacle, or antagonism. The ultimate limit of capitalist self-propelling productivity, is capital itself, that is, Capitalism's incessant development and revolutionizing of its own material conditions, the mad dance of its unconditional spiral of productivity, is ultimately nothing but a desperate fuite en avant to escape its own debilitating inherent contradictions. Marx's fundamental mistake was here to conclude, from these insights, that a new, higher social order, communism, was possible. An order that would not only maintain, but even raise to a higher degree and fully release the potential of the upward spiral of productivity, without it being thwarted by socially destructive economic crises. In short, what Marx overlooked is that, to put it in standard Derridian terms, this inherent obstacle, antagonism, as the condition of impossibility of the full deployment of the productive forces is simultaneously its condition of possibility. If we abolish the obstacle, the inherent contradiction of capitalism, we do not get the fully unleashed drive finally freed from its shackles, but rather we lose precisely this very productivity that seemed to be simultaneously generated and stifled by capitalism, for it simply dissipates. And it is as if this logic of the obstacle as a positive condition, which underlay the failure of socialist attempts to overcome capitalism, is now returning with a vengeance in capitalism itself. Capitalism can fully thrive not in the unencumbered reign of the market, but only when an obstacle, from minimal welfare state intervention up to and including the direct political rule of the Communist Party, as in the case of China, constrains its unimpeded rampage. So, ironically, this is the synthesis of capitalism and communism in Mao's sense. In a unique kind of poetic justice on a historic scale, it was capitalism which synthesized Maoist communism. The key new feature in China over the last few years has been the emergence of a large-scale workers' movement protesting against the work conditions, which are the price China pays for rapidly becoming the world's foremost manufacturing power. A movement which has faced brutal repression. New proof, if it is still needed, that China is today the ideal capitalist state. Freedom for capital, with the state doing the dirty job of controlling the workers. China, as the emerging superpower of the 21st century, thus seems to embody a new kind of capitalism. Disregard for ecological consequences, disdain for workers' rights, everything subordinated to the ruthless drive to develop and become the new world force. The big question is, what will the Chinese do with regard to the biogenetic revolution? Is it not a safe wager that they will hurl themselves into unconstrained genetic manipulation of plants, animals, and humans, bypassing all our Western moral prejudices and limitations? This is the ultimate price for Mao's theoretical mistake of rejecting the negation of the negation, of his failure to grasp how the negation of the negation is not a compromise between a position and its successively radical negation, but, on the contrary, the only true negation. And it is because Mao is unable to theoretically formulate this self-relating negation of form itself that he gets caught in the bad infinity of endless negating, scissions into two, subdivision. In Hegelese, Mao's dialectic remains at the level of understanding, of fixed notional oppositions. It is unable to formulate the properly dialectical self-relating of notional determinations. It is this serious mistake, to use a Stalinist term, which led Mao, when he was courageous enough to draw all the consequences from his stances, to reach a properly nonsensical conclusion that, in order to invigorate class struggle, one should directly open up the field to the enemy. Let them go in for capitalism. Society is very complex. If one only goes in for socialism and not for capitalism, isn't that too simple? Wouldn't we then lack the unity of opposites and be merely one-sided? Let them do it. Let them attack us madly, demonstrate in the streets, take up arms to rebel. I approve of all these things. Society is very complex. There is not a single commune, a single Seine, a single department of the Central Committee, which one cannot divide into two. This notion of dialectics provides the basic matrix of Mao's politics. Its repeated oscillation between liberal openness and then the hard-line purge. First, let the proverbial 100 flowers blossom so that the enemies will actualize and fully express their reactionary hidden tendencies. Then, once everyone's true positions are clearly articulated, engage in a ruthless struggle. Again, what Mao fails to do here is to proceed to the properly Hegelian identity of opposites. and to recognize in the force the revolution is fighting and trying to annihilate its own essence. As is the case in G.K. Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday, in which the secret police chief organizing the search for the anarchist leader and this mysterious leader, in the end, appear to be one and the same person. God himself, incidentally. And did Mao himself ultimately not play a similar role, that of a secular God who is at the same time the greatest rebel against himself? What this Chestertonian identity of the good Lord with the anarchist rebel enacts is the logic of the social carnival brought to the extreme of self-reflection. Anarchist outbursts are not a transgression of law and order. In our societies, anarchism already is in power wearing the mask of law and order. Our justice is the travesty of justice. The spectacle of law and order is an obscene carnival. The point made clear by arguably the greatest political poem in English, Shelley's The Mask of Anarchy, which describes the obscene parade of the figures of power. And many more destructions played in this ghastly masquerade, all disguised even to the eyes, like bishops, lawyers, peers, or spies. Last came Anarchy. He rode on a white horse splashed with blood. He was pale even to the lips, like death in the apocalypse. And he wore a kingly crown, and in his grasp a scepter shone. On his brow this mark I saw: I am God, and King, and Law. This identity is difficult to assume, even in cinema. Although V for Vendetta was praised, by none other than Tony Negri, among others, and even more criticized for its radical, pro-terrorist even stance, it does not push the logic to the end. It shirks from drawing the consequences from the parallels between Sutler and V, the totalitarian dictator, and the anarchist terrorist rebel. The Norsefire Party is, we learn, the instigator of the terror it is fighting. But what about the further identity of Sutler and V? In both cases, we never see their real faces, except the scared Sutler at the very end when he's about to die. Sutler we see only on TV screens, and V is a specialist in manipulating the screen. Furthermore, V's dead body is placed on the train packed with explosives, in a kind of Viking funeral, strangely evoking the name of the ruling party, Norsefire. So when Evie is imprisoned and tortured by V in order to learn how to overcome fear and be free, is this not parallel to what Sutler does to the entire English population, terrorizing them so that they become free and rebel? But the film fails to draw this Chestertonian lesson of the ultimate identity between V and Sutler. Cultural revolution and power. Is not this Hegelian Chestertonian shift from the criminal transgression of law and order to law and order itself as the highest criminal transgression, directly enacted by Mao? This is why, while setting in motion and secretly pulling the strings of the self-destructive carnival, Mao nonetheless remained exempted from its process. At no moment was there ever a serious threat that Mao himself would be ritualistically deposed, treated as yesterday a king, today a beggar. He was not the traditional master, but the lord of misrule. In the European Middle Ages, it was customary for great households to choose a lord of misrule. The person chosen was expected to preside over the rebels that briefly reversed or parodied the conventional social and economic hierarchies. When the brief reign of misrule was over, the customary order of things would be restored. The lords of misrule would go back to their menial occupations, while their social superiors resumed their wonted status. Sometimes the idea of lord of misrule would spill over from the realm of revel to the realm of politics. The apprentices took over from their guildmasters for a reckless day or two. Gender roles were reversed for a day as the women took over the tasks and airs normally associated only with men. Chinese philosophers also loved the paradoxes of status reversed, the ways that wit or shame could deflate pretension and lead to sudden shifts of insight. It was Mao's terrible accomplishment to seize on such insights from earlier Chinese philosophers, combine them with elements drawn from Western socialist thought, and to use both in tandem to prolong the limited concept of misrule into a long drawn-out adventure in upheaval. To Mao, the former lords and masters should never be allowed to return. He felt they were not his betters, and that society was liberated by their removal. He also thought the customary order of things should never be restored. Is, however, such a terrible accomplishment not the elementary gesture of every true revolutionary? Why make a revolution at all if we do not think that the customary order of things should never be restored? What Mao did was to deprive the transgression of its ritualized, ludic character by taking it seriously. Revolution is not just a temporary safety valve, a carnivalesque explosion destined to be followed by a process of sobering up. His problem was precisely the absence of the negation, the failure of the attempts to transpose revolutionary negativity into a truly new positive order. All temporary stabilizations of the revolution amounted to just so many restorations of the old order, so that the only way to keep the revolution alive was the spurious infinity of endlessly repeated negation, which reached its apex in the Great Cultural Revolution. In his Logique des Mondes, Badiou elaborated two subjective attitudes which counter an event: the reactive subject and the obscure subject. Insofar as one is ready to accept the risk of obscenely designating the reintroduction of capitalism into China a kind of event, one can claim that the Cultural Revolution and the revisionism identified by the name Deng Xiaoping stand, respectively, for the obscure and the reactive subject. Deng orchestrated the renaissance of capitalism in communist China, while the Cultural Revolution aimed at its total annihilation and was such precisely what Badiou calls un désert obscur. Badiou himself concedes that the final result of the Cultural Revolution was negative. It all began when, between 1966 and 1968, saturating in the real the previous hypotheses, the Red Guardist high school pupils and students, and then the workers of Shanghai, prescribed for the decades to come the affirmative realization of this beginning, of which they themselves, since their fury remained caught into what they were rising against, explored only the face of pure negation. One should take a step further here. What if the Cultural Revolution was negative, not only in the sense of clearing the space and opening up the way for a new beginning, but negative in itself? Negative is an index of its impotence in generating the new. This brings us back to the central weakness of Mao's thought and politics. Many a commentator has made ironic remarks about the apparent stylistic clumsiness of the titles of Soviet communist books and articles, such as their tautological character, with the repeated use of the same word, like revolutionary dynamics in the early stages of the Russian Revolution, or economic contradictions in the development of the Soviet economy. However, what if this tautology points towards an awareness of the logic of betrayal, best rendered by the classic reproach of Robespierre to the Dantonist opportunists? What you want is a revolution without a revolution. The tautological repetition thus signals the urge to repeat the negation, to relate it to itself. The true revolution is revolution with a revolution which in its course revolutionizes its own starting presuppositions. Hegel had a presentiment of this necessity when he wrote, "It is a modern folly to alter a corrupt ethical system, its constitution and legislation, without changing the religion, to have a revolution without a reformation." He thereby announced the necessity of a cultural revolution as the condition for the successful social revolution. This, then, should be our precise version of Robespierre's retort. What you want is a revolution without a reformation. The problem with revolutionary attempts hitherto is thus not that they were too extreme, but that they were not radical enough, that they did not question their own presuppositions. In a wonderful essay on Chevaugueur, Platonov's great peasant utopia written in 1927 and 1928, just prior to forced collectivization, Frederick Jameson describes the two moments of the revolutionary process. It begins with the gesture of radical negativity. The first moment of world reduction of the destruction of the idols and the sweeping away of an old world in violence and pain, is itself the precondition for the reconstruction of something else. A first moment of absolute immanence is necessary, the blank slate of absolute peasant immanence or ignorance, before new and undreamed of sensations and feelings can come into being. Then follows the second stage, the invention of a new life. Not only the construction of the new social reality in which our utopian dreams will be realized, but the reconstruction of these dreams themselves. A process that it would be too simple and misleading to call reconstruction or utopian construction, since in effect it involves the very effort to find a way to begin imagining utopia to begin with. Perhaps in a more Western kind of psychoanalytic language, we might think of the new onset of the utopian process as a kind of desiring to desire, a learning to desire, the invention of the desire called utopia in the first place, along with new rules for the fantasizing or daydreaming of such a thing. A set of narrative protocols with no precedent in our previous literary institutions. The reference to psychoanalysis is here crucial and very precise. In a radical revolution, people not only realize their old, emancipatory, etc. dreams, rather, they have to reinvent their very modes of dreaming. Is this not the exact formula of the link between the death drive and sublimation? Therein resides the necessity of the Cultural Revolution, clearly grasped by Mao, as Herbert Marcuse put it in another marvelous circular formula from the same epoch. Freedom from ideological constraints, from the predominant mode of dreaming, is the condition of liberation. That is, if we only change reality in order to realize our dreams, and do not change these dreams themselves, sooner or later we regress back to the old reality. There is a Hegelian positing of presuppositions at work here. The hard work of liberation retroactively forms its own presupposition. It is only this reference to what happens after the revolution, to the morning after, that allows us to distinguish between pathetic libertarian outbursts and true revolutionary upheavals. The former lose their energy when one has to start the prosaic work of social reconstruction. At this point, lethargy sets in. In contrast, recall the immense creativity of the Jacobins just prior to their fall, the numerous proposals about a new civic religion, about how to defend the dignity of old people, and so on. Therein also resides the interest of reading the reports about daily life in the Soviet Union in the early 1920s, with the enthusiastic urge to invent new rules for quotidian existence. What are the new rules of courting? How should one celebrate a birthday? At this point, the Cultural Revolution miserably failed. It is difficult to miss the irony of the fact that Badiou, who adamantly opposes the notion of the act as negative, locates the historical significance of the Maoist Cultural Revolution precisely in the negative gesture of signaling the end of the party state as the central production of revolutionary political activity. It is here that he should have been consistent and denied the evental status of the Cultural Revolution. Far from being an event, it was rather a supreme display of what Badiou likes to refer to as the morbid death drive. Destroying old monuments was not a true negation of the past. It was, once again, rather an impotent passage à l'acte, bearing witness to the failure to get rid of the past. So, in a way, there is a kind of poetic justice in the fact that the final result of Mao's Cultural Revolution is today's unheard-of explosion of capitalist dynamics in China. That is to say, with the full deployment of capitalism, especially in today's late capitalism, it is the predominant normal way of life which, in a way, becomes carnivalized, with constant self-revolutionizing, reversals, crises, and reinventions. Brian Masumi clearly formulated this deadlock, which is based on the fact that contemporary capitalism has already overcome the logic of totalizing normality and adopted that of erratic excess. The more varied and even erratic, the better. Normalcy starts to lose its hold. The regularities start to loosen. This loosening of normalcy is part of capitalism's dynamic. It's not a simple liberation. It's capitalism's own form of power. It's no longer disciplinary institutional power that defines everything. It's capitalism's power to produce variety, because markets get saturated. Produce variety, and you produce a niche market. The oddest of affective tendencies are okay, as long as they pay. Capitalism starts intensifying or diversifying affect, but only in order to extract surplus value. It hijacks affect in order to intensify profit potential. It literally valorizes affect. The capitalist logic of surplus value production starts to take over the relational field that is also the domain of political ecology, the ethical field of resistance to identity, and predictable paths. It's very troubling and confusing because it seems to me that there's been a certain kind of convergence between the dynamic of capitalist power and the dynamic of resistance. There is, thus, beyond all cheap jibes and superficial analogies, a profound structural homology between Maoist permanent self-revolutionizing, the continuous struggle against the ossification of state structures, and the inherent dynamics of capitalism. One is tempted to paraphrase Brecht here. His "What is the robbing of a bank compared to the founding of a new bank?" Yet again, what are the violent and destructive outbursts of a red guardist caught up in the Cultural Revolution compared to the true Cultural Revolution? The permanent dissolution of all life forms necessitated by capitalist reproduction. Today, the tragedy of the Great Leap Forward itself is repeating itself as the farce of the capitalist Great Leap Forward into modernization, with the old slogan, "An iron foundry in every village," re-emerging as a skyscraper in every street. It is the reign of contemporary global capitalism which is the true lord of misrule. No wonder, then, that in order to curb the excess of social disintegration caused by the capitalist explosion, Chinese officials celebrate religions and traditional ideologies which sustain social stability, from Buddhism to Confucianism. That is, the very ideologies that were the target of the Cultural Revolution. In April 2006, Yi Qiaowen, China's top religious official, told the Xinhua news agency that religion is one of the important forces from which China draws strength, and he singled out Buddhism for its unique role in promoting a harmonious society, the official formula for combining economic expansion with social development and care. The same week, China hosted the World Buddhist Forum. The role of religion as a stabilizing force against capitalist turbulence is thus officially sanctioned. What bothers the Chinese authorities in the case of sects like Falun Gong is merely their independence from state control. This is why one should also reject the argument that the Cultural Revolution strengthened socialist attitudes among the people, and thus helped to curb the worst disintegrative excesses of today's capitalist development. Quite the contrary, by undermining traditional stabilizing ideologies such as Confucianism, it rendered the people all the more vulnerable to the dizzying effects of capitalism. It is against this background that one should read the recent great campaign in China to resuscitate Marxism as effective state ideology. Literally hundreds of millions of US dollars are being invested in this venture. Those who see in this operation a threat to capitalist liberalization, a sign that hardliners want to reassert their hegemony, are totally missing the point. Paradoxical as it might sound, this return of Marxism is the sign of the ultimate triumph of capitalism, the sign of its thoroughgoing institutionalization. Recent legal measures which guarantee private property, hailed by the West as a crucial step towards legal stability, are part of the same thrust. That is to say, what kind of Marxism is being offered as appropriate for today's China? Emphasis is on the distinction between Marxism and leftism. Marxism is not the same as leftism, a term which refers to any talk of workers' liberation, from free trade unions to the overcoming of capitalism. Based on the Marxist thesis of the development of the forces of production as the key factor of social progress, the main task of progressive forces is defined as that of creating the conditions for the continuing rapid modernization, while avoiding all forms of instability, those caused by leftism, as well as those caused by rightism, campaigns for multi-party democracy, and so on, which will bring chaos and thus hinder the very modernization process. The conclusion is clear. In today's China, only the leading role of the Communist Party can sustain a rapid transformation of the conditions of social stability. The official Confucian term is that China should become a harmonious society. Consequently, to put it in the old Maoist terms, although it may appear that the main enemy is the bourgeois threat, the principal contradiction is, in the eyes of the ruling elite, the one between the existing harmonious order, unfettered capitalist development sustained by Communist Party rule, and the threat of workers' and peasants' revolts, which is why the recent strengthening of the oppressive apparatuses, the formation of special units of riot police to crush popular unrest and so forth, is the actual social expression of what, in ideology, appears as a revival of Marxism. The problem with this revival is that, to put it in Kant's terms, it totally subordinates Marxism to the private use of reason. For Kant, the public space of the world civil society designates the paradox of universal singularity, of a singular subject who, in a kind of short circuit, bypassing the mediation of the particular, directly participates in the universal. This is what Kant, in the famous passage of his What is Enlightenment, means by public as opposed to private. Private is not one's individual as opposed to communal ties, but the very communal institutional order of one's particular identification, while public is the transnational universality of the exercise of reason. The public use of one's reason must always be free, and it alone can bring about enlightenment among men. The private use of one's reason, on the other hand, may often be very narrowly restricted without particularly hindering the progress of enlightenment. By public use of one's reason, I understand the use which a person makes of it as a scholar before the reading public. Private use I call that which one may make of it in a particular civil post or office which is entrusted to him. The paradox of Kant's formula, think freely but obey, is thus that one participates in the universal dimension of the public sphere precisely as a singular individual extracted from or even opposed to one's substantial communal identification. One is truly universal only when radically singular, in the interstices of communal identities. Coming back to contemporary China, the artificially resuscitated form of Marxism is an exemplary case of the private use of reason. Marxism is mobilized not on account of its inherent universal truth, but in order to legitimize the present Chinese state interest of maintaining Communist Party power and thus guaranteeing stability in a period of fast-moving economic development. Such a use of Marxism is objectively cynical, with no cognitive value at all. The tragedy is that the Chinese state will sooner or later encounter the limits of the formula capitalism with Confucian values. And at that point, only an unconstrained public use of reason will be able to do the job of inventing new solutions. No wonder that, in today's China, the two terms public intellectual and civil society are very negatively viewed in official eyes, although they are not explicitly prohibited. Every intellectual knows that it is better to avoid them if one wants to remain on good terms with those in power. Anything, almost, is permitted in closed academic debates. That is, as long as it does not reach the general public. The paradoxical status of contemporary Chinese Marxism is conditioned by the fact that China in the 21st century is indeed no longer a totalitarian state, but rather what some would call an authoritarian state. There are passionate public debates, different opinions on key issues are openly defended, but within very precise limits. One cannot directly put into question the Communist Party's political monopoly. While one can draw attention to ecological problems, one is obliged to do it with great restraint, avoiding hot topics like the gigantic Yellow River Dam. Although one can write about the terrible conditions of unskilled manual workers, one should treat it as a local anomaly and never propose the formation of any type of workers' defense organization, such as independent labor unions. And one is often compelled to use a coded language, such as formulating a critique of socialism as advocacy of one socialist orientation against another one. How then do leading communist theorists react when confronted with the all too obvious contradiction? A communist party which still legitimizes itself in Marxist terms, but renounces Marxism's basic premise, that of work as self-organization, as a revolutionary force in order to overthrow capitalism. It is difficult to avoid the impression that all the resources of the legendary form of Chinese politeness are mobilized here. It is considered impolite to directly raise or insist on these questions. This resort to politeness is necessary, since it is the only way to combine what cannot be combined. To enforce Marxism as official ideology while openly prohibiting its central axioms would cause the collapse of the entire ideological edifice, thereby rendering it meaningless. The result is thus that, while certain things are clearly prohibited, this prohibition cannot be publicly stated, but is itself prohibited. It is not merely prohibited to raise the question of workers' self-organization against capitalist exploitation as the central tenet of Marxism. It is also prohibited to publicly claim that it is prohibited to raise this question. What one usually hears from theorists is a private admission that, of course, this is contradictory, but that, nonetheless, such a contradictory ideological edifice works, and works spectacularly. It is the only way to ensure fast economic growth and stability in China. Need we add that this is the private use of reason at its purest? This paradox is nicely rendered in the title of a recent report on China. Even what's secret is a secret in China. Many troublesome intellectuals who report on political oppression, ecological catastrophes, rural poverty, and so on, for example, a Chinese woman who sent her husband, who lives abroad, clippings from a local Chinese newspaper, suffer years of imprisonment for betraying state secrets. However, many of the laws and regulations that make up the state secret regime are themselves classified, making it difficult for individuals to know how and when they're in violation. This secrecy of the prohibition itself serves two different purposes which should not be confused. Its commonly admitted role is that of universalizing guilt and fear. If you do not know what is prohibited, you cannot even know when you are violating a prohibition, which makes you potentially guilty all the time. Of course, things are more precise here. Except at the climax of the Stalinist purges, when, effectively, everyone could be found guilty, people do know when they are doing something that will annoy those in power. The function of prohibiting prohibitions is thus not to give rise to irrational fears, but to let the potential dissidents, who think they can get away with their critical activity, since they are not breaking any laws, but only doing what laws guarantee them, freedom of opinion, and so on, know that if they irk those in power too much, they can be punished at the latter's whim. Don't provoke us. We can do whatever we want to you. No laws are protecting you here. In ex-Yugoslavia, the infamous Article 133 of the Penal Code could always be invoked to prosecute writers and journalists. It criminalized any text that falsely presented the achievements of the socialist revolution or that might arouse tension and discontent among the public due to the way it dealt with political, social, or other topics. This last category is obviously not only infinitely plastic, but also conveniently self-referential. Does not the very fact that you are accused by those in power obviously mean that you have aroused tension and discontent among the public? During those years, I remember asking a Slovene politician how he justified this law. He just smiled and with a wink told me, well, we have to have some tool to discipline when we want those who annoy us. But there is another function of prohibiting prohibitions which is no less crucial, that of maintaining appearances. And we all know how absolutely crucial appearances were under Stalinism. The Stalinist regime reacted with total panic whenever there was a threat that appearances would be disturbed. Say that some accident which made clear the failure of the regime might be reported in the public media. There were, in the Soviet media, no black chronicles, no reports on crimes and prostitution, not to mention workers or other types of public protests. Which is why this prohibition of prohibitions is far from limited to communist regimes. It is operative also in today's permissive capitalism. A postmodern boss insists that he is not a master, but just a coordinator of our joint creative efforts, the first among equals. There should be no formalities among us. We should address him by his nickname. He shares a dirty joke with us. But during all this, he remains our master. In such a social link, relations of domination function through their denial. In order to be operative, they have to be ignored. We are not only obliged to obey our masters, we are also obliged to act as if we were free and equal, as if there was no domination, which of course makes the situation even more humiliating. Paradoxically, in such a situation, the first act of liberation is to demand from the master that he act like one. One should reject false collegiality from the master and insist that he treat us with cold distance as a master. The same goes for patriarchal domination over women. In modern societies, this domination is no longer admitted as such, which is why one of the subversive tactics of feminine resistance is mockingly to act as if subordinated. Things go even deeper here. The ultimate ground of this paradox is the shift in social relations that occurs with the rise of capitalism itself. One should apply here Marx's old formula of commodity fetishism, in which relations between people appear as relations between things. This is why, in capitalism, we are as people, as persons, all equal, possessing the same dignity and freedom. The relations of domination, which were in previous societies directly hierarchical relations among persons, are now transposed onto relations between things, commodities. The logic of domination, which necessarily denies itself as domination, is inscribed into the very core of capitalist relations. What one should bear in mind is that while every social structure relies on certain exclusions and prohibitions, this exclusionary logic is always redoubled. Not only is the subordinated other, homosexuals, non-white races, excluded, repressed, the excluding and repressive power itself relies on an excluded, repressed, obscene content of its own. Say, the exercise of power that legitimizes itself as legal, tolerant, Christian, relies on a set of publicly disavowed obscene rituals of violent humiliation of the subordinated. More generally, we are dealing here with what one is tempted to call the ideological practice of disidentification. That is to say, one should turn around the standard notion of ideology as providing a firm identification for its subjects, constraining them to their social roles. What if, at a different, but no less irrevocable and structurally necessary level, ideology is effected precisely by way of constructing a space of false disidentification, of false distance towards the actual coordinates of the subject's social existence? Is this logic of disidentification not discernible from the most elementary case of I am not only an American, husband, worker, Democrat, gay man, but beneath all these roles and masks, a human being, a complex and unique personality, where the very distance towards the symbolic feature that determines my social place guarantees the effectiveness of this determination, up to the more complex case of cyberspace, playing with one's multiple identities. The mystification operative in the perverse just gaming of cyberspace is thus double. Not only are the games we are playing in it more serious than we tend to assume, is it not that in the guise of a fiction of it's just a game, a subject can articulate and stage sadistic, perverse, and so on, features of his symbolic identity that he would never be able to admit in his real intersubjective context? But the opposite also holds. That is, the much celebrated playing with multiple shifting personae, freely constructed identities, tends to obfuscate and thus falsely liberate us from the constraints of social space in which our existence is caught. This long detour brings us back to the paradox of contemporary Chinese Marxism. It is easy, from the standpoint of libertarian Western Marxism, to mock this Marxism, which dispenses with Marxism's central emancipatory premise, a truly decaffeinated Marxism, Marxism deprived of its subversive core. However, any direct ironic critique of this new Chinese state ideology Marxism misses the point, which is that we are not dealing with a simple betrayal of Marxism, but literally with its symptom, a formula to resolve its inconsistency. There effectively was, in original Marxism itself, a dimension which potentially led to the enslavement of the workers to progress, the rapid development of the forces of production. While under Stalinism this progress was organized within the framework of the centralized state economy, today's China draws the logical conclusion that the most efficient motor of development are capitalist relations of production. The premise of classical Marxism, up to and including Tony Negri, was that history is on our side. Workers' resistance to capitalism objectively serves an even faster development of the forces of production. It is itself a sign that capitalism is no longer a motor, but more and more an obstacle to this development. What to do then when capitalism de facto proves itself as the most effective motor of social relations? The answer is the Chinese solution: to honestly admit that, in this phase of world history, we should fully embrace capitalism. Where Marxism enters is in the claim that only the leading role of the Communist Party can sustain such modernization and simultaneously maintain a harmonious society. That is, prevent the social disintegration that characterizes Western liberal capitalism. This capitalist reappropriation of revolutionary dynamics is not without its comic side effects. It was recently made public that, in order to conceptualize the Israeli Defense Forces' urban warfare against the Palestinians, the IDF military academics systematically refer to Deleuze and Guattari, especially to Thousand Plateaus, using it as operational theory. The catchwords used are formless rival entities, fractal maneuver, velocity versus rhythms, the Wahhabi war machine, postmodern anarchists, nomadic terrorists. One of the key distinctions they rely on is the one between smooth and striated space, which reflect the organizational concepts of the war machine and the state apparatus. The IDF now often uses the term to smooth out space when they want to refer to operation in a space as if it had no borders. Palestinian areas are thought of as striated in the sense that they are enclosed by fences, walls, ditches, roadblocks, and so on. The attack conducted by units of the IDF on the city of Nablus in April 2002 was described by its commander, Brigadier General Aviv Kokavi, as inverse geometry, which he explained as the reorganization of the urban syntax by means of a series of micro-tactical actions. During the battle, soldiers moved within the city across hundreds of meters of overground tunnels carved out through a dense and contiguous urban structure. Although several thousand soldiers and Palestinian guerrillas were maneuvering simultaneously in the city, they were so saturated into the urban fabric that very few would have been visible from the air. Furthermore, they used none of the city's streets, roads, alleys, or courtyards, or any of the external doors, internal stairwells, and windows, but moved horizontally through walls, and vertically through holes blasted in ceilings and floors. This form of movement, described by the military as infestation, seeks to redefine inside as outside, and domestic interiors as thoroughfares. The IDF strategy of walking through walls involves a conception of the city as not just the site, but also the very medium of warfare, a flexible, almost liquid medium that is forever contingent and in flux. So what follows from all this? Not, of course, the nonsensical accusation that Deleuze and Guattari are theorists of militaristic colonization, but the conclusion that the conceptual machinery articulated by Deleuze and Guattari, far from being simply subversive, also fits the military, economic, and ideologico-political operational mode of contemporary capitalism. How then are we to revolutionize an order whose very principle is constant self-revolutionizing? Although a failure, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, GPCR, was unique in attacking the key point. Not just the takeover of state power, but the new economic organization and reorganization of daily life. Its failure was precisely the failure to create a new form of everyday life. It remained a carnivalesque excess, with the state apparatus, under Zhu Enlai's control, guaranteeing the reproduction and maintenance of everyday life, of production. At the level of social reality, there is obviously some truth to the claim that the Cultural Revolution was triggered by Mao in order to establish his power, which had been seriously curtailed in the early 1960s, in the aftermath of the spectacular failure of the Great Leap Forward, when the majority of nomenclatura staged a silent inner-party coup against him. It is true that the Cultural Revolution brought incalculable suffering, that it cut deep wounds in the social fabric, that its story can be told as the story of fanatical crowds chanting slogans. However, this is not simply the entire story. In spite of, or rather because of, all its horrors, the Cultural Revolution undoubtedly did contain elements of an enacted utopia. At its very end, before the agitation was blocked by Mao himself, since he had by then achieved his goal of re-establishing his influence and getting rid of the top nomenclatura competitors, there was the Shanghai Commune. 1 million workers who simply took the official slogan seriously, demanding the abolition of the state and even the party itself, and the direct communal organization of society. It is significant that it was at this very point that Mao ordered the army to intervene and to restore order. The paradox is that of a leader who triggers an uncontrolled upheaval while trying to exert full personal power. The overlapping of extreme dictatorship with extreme emancipation of the masses. The argument that the GPCR was triggered by Mao in order to get rid of rivals in the inner party struggle and reassert his authority, and that it was tamed by the intervention of the army the moment it threatened to spiral out of control, is irrelevant here. Even if true, it simply confirms that the events acquired a dynamic of their own. This genuinely revolutionary aspect of the Cultural Revolution is sometimes admitted even by conservative critics compelled to take note of the paradox of the totalitarian leader, teaching people to think and act for themselves, to rebel and destroy the very apparatus of totalitarian domination. Here is what Gordon Chang recently wrote in the conservative journal Commentary. Paradoxically, it was Mao himself, the great enslaver, who in his own way taught the Chinese people to think and act for themselves. In the Cultural Revolution, he urged tens of millions of radical youths to go to every corner of the country to tear down ancient temples, destroy cultural relics, and denounce their elders, including not only mothers and fathers, but also government officials and Communist Party members. The Cultural Revolution may have been Mao's idea of ruining his enemies, but it became a frenzy that destroyed the fabric of society. As government broke down, its functions taken over by revolutionary committees and people's communes, the strict restraints and repressive mechanisms of the state dissolved. People no longer had to wait for someone to instruct them what to do. Mao had told them they had the right to rebel. For the radical young, this was a time of essentially unrestrained passion. In one magnificent stroke, the great helmsman had delegitimized almost all forms of authority. What this means is that we can read the Cultural Revolution at two different levels. If we read it as part of historical reality, being, we can easily submit it to a dialectical analysis, which perceives the final outcome of a historical process as its truth. The ultimate failure of the Cultural Revolution bears witness to the inherent inconsistency of the very project, notion of Cultural Revolution. It is the explication, deployment, actualization of these inconsistencies, in the same way that, for Marx, the vulgar, non-heroic, capitalist daily reality of profit-seeking is the truth of noble Jacobin revolutionary heroism. If, however, we analyze it as an event, as an enactment of the eternal idea of egalitarian justice, then the ultimate factual result of the Cultural Revolution, its catastrophic failure and reversal into the recent capitalist transformation, does not exhaust the real of the Cultural Revolution. The eternal idea of the Cultural Revolution survives its defeat in socio-historical reality. It continues to lead an underground spectral life of the ghosts of failed utopias which haunt the future generations, patiently awaiting their next resurrection. This brings us back to Robespierre, who expressed in a touching way the simple faith in the eternal idea of freedom, which persists through all defeats, without which, as was clear to Robespierre, a revolution is just a noisy crime that destroys another crime. The faith most poignantly expressed in Robespierre's very last speech on 8 Thermidor 1794, the day before his arrest and execution. But there do exist, I can assure you, souls that are feeling and pure. It exists, that tender, imperious, and irresistible passion, the torment and delight of magnanimous hearts, that deep horror of tyranny, that compassionate zeal for the oppressed, that sacred love for the homeland, that even more sublime and holy love for humanity, without which a great revolution is just a noisy crime that destroys another crime. It does exist, that generous ambition to establish here on earth the world's first republic. Does the same not hold, even more so, for the last big installment in the life of this idea, the Maoist Cultural Revolution? Without this idea, which sustained revolutionary enthusiasm, the Cultural Revolution was to an even greater degree just a noisy crime that destroys another crime. One should recall here Hegel's sublime words on the French Revolution from his Lectures on the Philosophy of World History. It has been said that the French Revolution resulted from philosophy, and it is not without reason that philosophy has been called Weltweisheit, world wisdom. For it is not only truth in and for itself as the pure essence of things, but also truth in its living form, as exhibited in the affairs of the world. We should not, therefore, contradict the assertion that the revolution received its first impulse from philosophy. Never since the sun had stood in the firmament and the planets revolved around him had it been perceived that man's existence centers in his head, i.e., in thought, inspired by which he builds up the world of reality. Not until now has man advanced to the recognition of the principle that thought ought to govern spiritual reality. This was accordingly a glorious mental dawn, all thinking being shared in the jubilation of this epoch. Emotions of a lofty character stirred men's minds at that time. A spiritual enthusiasm thrilled through the world, as if the reconciliation between the divine and the secular was now first accomplished. This, of course, did not prevent Hegel from coldly analyzing the inner necessity of this explosion of abstract freedom in turning into its opposite, self-destructive revolutionary terror. However, one should never forget that Hegel's critique is imminent, accepting the basic principles of the French Revolution and its key supplement, the Haitian Revolution, and one should proceed in exactly the same way apropos the October Revolution and later the Chinese Revolution. It was, as Badiou pointed out, the first case in the entire history of humanity of the successful revolt of the exploited poor. They were the zero-level members of the new society. They set the standards. The revolution stabilized itself into a new social order. A new world was created and miraculously survived for decades amid unthinkable economic and military pressure and isolation. This was effectively a glorious mental dawn, all thinking being shared in the jubilation of this epoch. Against all hierarchical orders, egalitarian universality directly came to power. There is a basic philosophical dilemma which underlies this alternative. It may seem that the only consistent Hegelian standpoint is the one which measures the notion by the success or failure of its actualization, so that, in the perspective of the total mediation of the essence by its appearance, any transcendence of the idea over its actualization is discredited. The consequence of this is that if we insist on the eternal idea, which survives its historical defeat, this necessarily entails, in Hegelese, a regression from the level of the notion as the fully actualized unity of essence and appearance to the level of the essence supposed to transcend its appearance. Is it really so, however? One can also claim that the excess of the utopian idea that survives its historical defeat does not contradict the total mediation of idea and its appearance. The basic Hegelian insight according to which the failure of reality to fully actualize an idea is simultaneously the failure, limitation, of this idea itself continues to hold. What one should simply add is that the gap that separates the idea from its actualization signals a gap within this idea itself. This is why the spectral idea that continues to haunt historical reality signals the falsity of the new historical reality itself, its inadequacy to its own notion. The failure of the Jacobin utopia, its actualization in utilitarian bourgeois reality, is simultaneously the limitation of this reality itself. Consequently, one should invert the commonplace reading of Lacan's Kant avec Sade, according to which Sadian perversion is the truth of Kant, more radical than Kant, that it draws out the consequences Kant himself did not have the courage to confront. But we would claim the contrary. Sadian perversion emerges as the result of the Kantian compromise, of Kant's avoidance of the consequences of his breakthrough. Sade is the symptom of Kant. While it is true that Kant retreated from drawing all the consequences of his ethical revolution, the space for the figure of Sade is opened up by this Kantian compromise, by his unwillingness to push through to the end, to retain full fidelity to his philosophical breakthrough. Far from being simply and directly the truth of Kant, Sade is the symptom of Kant's betrayal of the truth of his own discovery. The obscene Sadian jouisseur is a stigma bearing witness to Kant's ethical compromise, the apparent radicality of this figure, the willingness of the Sardian hero to go to the end in his will to enjoy, is a mask of its exact opposite. In other words, the true horror is not a Sardian orgy, but the real core of the Kantian ethic itself. If we can be forgiven paraphrasing Brecht yet again, what is the miserable evil of a Sardian group orgy in comparison with the diabolical evil that pertains to a pure ethical act? And, mutatis mutandis, the same applies to the relationship between the Chinese Cultural Revolution and today's explosion of capitalist development as its truth. This explosion is also a sign that Mao retreated from drawing all the consequences of the Cultural Revolution. That is, the space for the capitalist explosion was opened up by this compromise, by Mao's unwillingness to push through to the end, to retain full fidelity to the idea of the Cultural Revolution. And the lesson is, in both cases, that of Kant as well as that of Mao. The same, namely, that we take from Beckett's Worstwood Hoe. Try again, fail better.